Japan did not immediately fear the P-38 Lightning. That misunderstanding is what makes this story so revealing. What Japanese pilots believed they were facing, what they reported after brief encounters, and what they slowly came to realize did not align. And that gap carried real consequences in the air. This is not a story built on myth or exaggeration, but on the quieter assessments Japan made as evidence accumulated. Long before Japanese pilots engaged the P-38 in sustained combat, it had already been filtered through assumptions shaped by doctrine, experience, and the institutional confidence earned during the early years of the war. Japan did not ignore the Lightning, it misread it. Japanese fighter philosophy was rooted in short-range dominance, where aircraft operated close to base, sought decisive engagements, and relied on maneuverability and pilot skill above all else. Speed mattered only insofar as it supported turning combat, while range was seen as a logistical burden rather than a tactical weapon. When reports described a large twin-engine American fighter, analysts instinctively classified it as compromised, too heavy, too complex, and dependent on circumstances rather than skill. Early sightings seemed to confirm this view. The Lightning avoided prolonged dogfights, performed poorly in low-speed turns, and disengaged quickly, leading pilots to conclude it lacked finesse. These observations were technically correct, but strategically misleading, because Japanese intelligence failed to place them within a fundamentally different combat philosophy. Confidence further delayed reassessment. The Zero had dominated Allied aircraft from 1941 through early 1942. And that success bred resistance to questioning a doctrine that had delivered victory. Acknowledging the P-38 as a systemic threat would have meant challenging the very framework that defined Japanese air combat. Fragmented intelligence compounded the problem, as encounters were brief, scattered. An individually unremarkable one unit met the Lightning at range, another saw it escort bombers. But no single engagement appeared decisive enough to trigger immediate alarm. Only later did analysts realize that these scattered observations were part of a larger pattern. Japan evaluated the P-38 Lightning as an individual aircraft rather than as an integrated system. Its engines, armament, and size were examined independently. And what was missed was how these elements combined to enable a style of combat Japan was unprepared to counter. The Lightning was not built to win traditional dogfights. It was designed to deny them. By the time Japanese command began questioning why expected limitations were not manifesting in combat, the aircraft had already established itself operationally and the opportunity to adapt early, when losses were still manageable, had quietly passed. What Japan initially failed to grasp was not the Lightning's performance, but its intent, and by the time that intent became clear, the situation had already changed. As encounters multiplied during 1943, Japanese pilots began recognizing consistency where they had once seen coincidence. The Lightning did not behave unpredictably. It acted deliberately, signaling design and strategy rather than improvisation. Reports from different theaters began to align. This fighter appeared earlier than expected, operated farther from base, and disengaged cleanly, often disappearing and then reappearing minutes later from another direction. This repeated presence contradicted long-held assumptions about American fuel endurance and operational limits. Timing proved to be the most disruptive factor. Japanese pilots, trained to calculate engagement windows based on fuel and withdrawal points, found those calculations consistently failing. Airspace that should have cleared remained contested, eroding confidence at both the pilot and command level. Equally troubling was the Lightning's selectivity. It did not chase recklessly, but struck only when advantage was clear and disengaged when conditions shifted, forcing Japanese units into a reactive posture. Initiative, once central to Japanese air tactics, began to slip away. Attempts to adapt were cautious and limited. Tactical advisories emphasized formation discipline and warned against vertical pursuit. But these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. They reduced losses without restoring control. Pilots could survive encounters, but they could not dictate outcomes, and the psychological toll was significant. Accustomed to decisive engagements, they were now confronted with ambiguity. never knowing if a fight was truly over or if disengagement meant safety. Commanders recognized the threat but faced constraints. New aircraft designs were not ready, training pipelines were already strained, and tactical reform required time Japan no longer had. Recognition without control became the defining reality of Japanese encounters with the Lightning. By mid-war, Japan understood what the P-38 was doing, but it could not stop it. That gap between awareness and capability was reflected not only in reports, but in pilot behavior itself. Japan never issued a formal declaration acknowledging the P-38 as superior. Instead, the truth emerged in altered behavior. As encounters accumulated, Japanese pilots began flying differently not because doctrine had changed, but because survival demanded it. Aggression gave way to caution as engagements were entered later and exited sooner. Altitude was guarded carefully, and pilots avoided prolonged climbs or pursuits that exposed them to unseen threats. None of this was framed as retreat, it was framed as judgment, but the shift was unmistakable. The P-38 Lightning imposed mental strain through denial rather than domination, rarely offering closure. Pilots fought briefly, lost contact, and remained unsure whether danger had truly passed. This uncertainty demanded constant vigilance. Draining focus and increasing fatigue, transforming combat from episodic encounters into continuous anticipation. The effect was amplified by the Lightning's durability. As Japanese pilots reported hitting it effectively, only to watch it escape, undermining confidence and making success difficult to measure while keeping risk constant. As veteran pilots were lost, new aviators inherited this environment with minimal training and combat experience against an opponent that punished hesitation and rewarded discipline, creating lethal deficiencies. The Lightning did not need to win every engagement. It simply shaped the conditions under which battles occurred, eroding initiative by forcing restraint, undermining morale by surviving damage, and dictating outcomes indirectly by controlling tempo. By late war, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of the Lightning with curiosity or contempt. They spoke of it as an ever-present factor that influenced decisions before combat even began. Japan never admitted defeat in doctrine, but in practice, the Lightning had already imposed one. When an aircraft changes how its enemy thinks, the battle ceases to be fought only in the air. By the time Japanese planners fully recognized the P-38 as a serious threat, the issue was no longer tactical, but structural. The aircraft exposed weaknesses embedded deep within Japan's air war system. Japan's strategy had been built for short, intense campaigns near controlled territory, with fighters optimized for quick interception and decisive engagements, while fuel capacity, pilot endurance, and long-term air presence were secondary. This approach had worked early in the war, but the P-38 shattered that equilibrium, forcing Japanese units to operate defensively across expanded airspace. Sustaining longer patrols, maintaining alertness without clear engagement windows, and tightening fuel margins, these pressures compounded rapidly in an air force already stretched thin by logistics and attrition. Attempts to counter the Lightning at an organizational level revealed further constraints. New aircraft programs lagged behind operational needs. Engine developments struggled to match high-altitude American designs. And training programs could not expand flight hours quickly enough to replace losses. Tactical awareness grew faster than institutional capacity to respond. While the Lightning benefited from systemic American advantages, Japan could not replicate our coordination. Flexible command structures and standardized pilot training reinforced its effectiveness. Japanese planners recognized this imbalance but lacked the industrial and logistical base to offset it. The problem was no longer the Lightning itself, but the ecosystem that supported it. This created strategic friction that forced Japanese air units to prioritize survival over dominance, making missions more conservative and causing initiative to slip gradually rather than collapse outright. Air superiority was not lost in a single campaign, but through sustained pressure applied by aircraft like the P-38, which denied recovery time and compounded the effects of fatigue, reduced confidence, and strained resources. There was no decisive counterstroke available, only endurance, which increasingly favored the Americans. By late in the war, Japanese planners recognized that even if the Lightning were removed, the underlying problem would remain: The structure of their air power was mismatched to the conflict it now faced. Recognition arrived without remedy, raising a sobering question. If the Lightning was not an exception, what did its success imply for everything that would follow? Japan's ultimate assessment of the P-38 was neither admiration nor resentment, it was resignation. By the final stages of the war, the aircraft had come to represent something larger than individual performance. Symbolizing a shift in air combat Japan could no longer contest. The Lightning demonstrated that control of airspace no longer depended on winning traditional dogfights, but on dictating when and where combat occurred. Speed, endurance, coordination, and survivability mattered more than elegance or maneuverability. A hard truth for an Air Force whose identity had been forged through close combat and pilot virtuosity. Japanese evaluations acknowledged that the Lightning was not invulnerable. Skilled pilots could still exploit its weaknesses. But the conditions required were increasingly rare, and its ability to disengage, recover, and return meant that even successful encounters often failed to produce decisive results. Over time, its presence reshaped Japanese expectations of air combat. Engagements were no longer assumed to be symmetrical. Confidence gave way to risk assessment, and pursuit was replaced by avoidance. These subtle shifts transformed operational behavior across entire units. While highlighting the growing disparity in pilot experience, American pilots rotated, trained, and returned with accumulated knowledge. While Japanese pilots were lost permanently, each Lightning sortie deepened that imbalance, accelerating decline through attrition rather than dramatic defeat. In this sense, the P-38 was less a weapon than a mechanism. It enforced a tempo Japan could not sustain, punished errors without exposing itself, and demanded discipline while exploiting fatigue, making it strategically decisive even when tactically restrained by the end of the war. Japanese reflections on the P-38 Lightning were clear-eyed. It was not feared because it was unbeatable, but respected because it represented a form of warfare Japan had neither anticipated nor could adapt to under fire. What Japan ultimately thought of the Lightning was not captured in a single report. It was reflected in altered pilot behavior, diminished initiative, and the quiet acceptance of an air war that had moved beyond their control. And the question lingers, was the Lightning the end of an era, or the beginning of a new one entirely? The P-38 did not defeat Japan through spectacle or myth. It did so by revealing limitations that doctrine, skill, and courage alone could not overcome. Japan came to see in the Lightning not just an enemy aircraft, but a warning that air warfare had fundamentally changed. If this story has reshaped your understanding of the Pacific Air War, keep watching Vintage Planes, because every aircraft has a deeper truth waiting to be discovered.